Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
Ah, Richter Belmont. I don't know if you noticed, but the Smash Brothers invitation is that way. It seems you got the wrong location. Because I know not if you're aware of this. However, this is my castle.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
You know, for a Belmont, you're awfully wordy, and not in the good way. And besides, what does a Belmont know of saving mankind? If anything, a Belmont only prolongs the fate of darkness to return to lands. You know not of what you speak, and besides, your words have as much meaning as a banana peel to a French nobleman. But I've had enough of our little squabble. Hellfire Inferno! Castlevania, a game franchise that spawned a lot of good games, yet also a lot of bad ones. Some are rightfully hated, while others not so much. Some are overly praised, while others don't get enough of it, and so on and so forth. Luckily though, I am here to cover the good games that this franchise has spawned. Now, as to why I'm doing this, well, there are two reasons. First things first, there are going to be people that are looking forward to getting into the Castlevania franchise. However, they're not exactly sure as to which games to start off with. Some people may tell them to start with Lament of Innocence, as that is chronologically the first game in the series. However, some people might give them Symphony of the Night, because that's the best game in the franchise, according to most people. So, I compiled 10 of the best Castlevania games in the entire franchise. So then that way, you can start off at any of these games and you won't feel like shit for playing it. Number 2, I like opinions, and I also like hearing others' opinions, and I also like sharing said opinions. So, the best way to get a formal dialogue going is to share opinions. As I do love some of the comments that I read sometimes under my videos, as they always give their insights on things that I would never have probably thought about. Besides, what do we have to lose? Our dignity? Don't worry, Konami took it away from us like 10 years ago. So alright, my Cherryful Chariots, let's get ready for the top 10 best Castlevania games. Oh, before we start though, do remember that these are opinions, so do not get upset if I don't say that this Castlevania game is here. As I'm sure we can agree that some Castlevania games are good, we just can't agree on placements. So yeah, if you really feel like it, you can send in your top 10 favorite Castlevania games in the comments. Then I will probably read it, cause, you know, I like reading things. So yeah, enjoy the video. Ta-ta! So starting this list off, I pose a question. Have you played Castlevania 1? Oh, you have. But now let me ask you this. Have you played Super Castlevania 4? Oh, you have as well. Are you ready to play the same game for the third time? Castlevania Chronicles, the second Castlevania game to go on the PlayStation, and the one that everyone forgets exists. And it's kind of shocking considering that this game is by no means terrible, considering that you're getting the arranged version and the Japanese version, which in itself had 3 other versions tied to it. I'd say you're getting a good deal. Granted, you're playing Castlevania 1 all over again, but hey, no one gives Super Castlevania 4 shit, so I don't want to hear anyone giving this game shit for doing the same thing. Hell, I'll even argue that Castlevania Chronicles does some stuff well compared to Super Castlevania 4. For example, the OST. Now granted, both games have good OSTs, but if my life was on the line, chances are I would be picking Castlevania Chronicles when it came to music. As far as gameplay is concerned, it's less complicated than Super Castlevania 4's, meaning that you can't choose the direction that the whip wants to go in. You basically just attack in one direction. But most Castlevania games do this anyway. Hell, even the more modern Castlevania games do this. So faulting Chronicles for not having what Super Castlevania 4 had is kinda silly. In terms of graphics, the game benefits for being on the PlayStation 1, so it's a plus. As far as enemies go, it's the same thing. However, in this game they chose to give us a unique cast of bosses to fight. Granted, some are easy, some are hard, some are taken from other sources while others are completely new, but that's every Castlevania game for you. If you ask me, this is the most definitive version of Castlevania 1. Sure, you can play Super Castlevania 4 as well, but frankly, I prefer this version the most. And besides, that soundtrack is a fucking bop. Anyway, with that aside, now we can safely move on to number 9. In case you were thinking, no, the next one is not Super Castlevania 4. Castlevania Bloodlines, the only Castlevania game to ever go on the Sega Genesis, and the most stylistically appealing Castlevania game by far. So let's go over some of the positives, shall we? Well, for starters, this game looks amazing. All down to the particle effects and even the animations, they all sync very well together, creating a unique style that not many Castlevania games have been able to replicate. Hell, if I had to put frickin' Bloodlines in a lineup, people would be able to recognize Bloodlines instantly. As far as the story goes, it's not really the most complicated thing in the world, but it is nice. Plus, if you play the game on harder difficulties, you get 2 different endings for both of the characters that you're able to play, Eric the Card and John Morris. As you can see, the Belmonts are clearly absent from here. Why exactly? Well, you're gonna have to brush up on your Castlevania lore to figure that one out. As far as gameplay is concerned, you have 2 options really. You can either John Morris, where you'll get the stereotypical Belmont experience, also the Super Castlevania 4 one, but you'll get what I mean. And then you have Eric the Card, who has a special ability that allows him to do high jumps, allowing him to get to places where John Morris can't. Just take my fucking money. As far as the game's soundtrack goes, it is amazing. In fact, I can safely say that this game introduced a lot of classics into the Castlevania lineup. For example, Iron Blue Intention. But then we move on to the other things like the enemies and bosses. The enemies aren't too difficult to deal with, however there are just some that are absolute nuisances, but that's stereotypical 2D side-scroller Castlevania for you. As far as bosses, although they are simple in design, they are really fun to fight against. In fact, this game alone has some of my favorite bosses in the entire series. However, I won't say which, because that's a topic for another day. However, you're just gonna have to take my word on the fact that some of these bosses are very well crafted. And it's the best game in the Anniversary Collection. So if you have it, play it. Granted, you are going to die. A lot. However, that's just stereotypical Castlevania formula. And I can tell you this, you are not gonna have wasted time playing this game. But I can safely say we can move on to number 8. Remember Castlevania the Adventure? Do you remember how bad that game is? Okay, got a picture in your mind? Good. Now what if I told you, in the year 2009, Konami chose to remake the game? Castlevania Adventure Rebirth. A WiiWare game for the, you guessed it, Wii. You know, out of all the Castlevania games that needed a remake, Castlevania the Adventure needed one desperately. And so, Konami heard, and they delivered. So how good is the Adventure Rebirth anyway? Surprisingly, it holds up very well. Considering that the game is most likely akin to being Bloodlines, you can obviously tell due to stage 1, it by and large, and by itself, is a solid experience. The stages are well crafted, but sometimes there's bullshit. But then again, I'm a Castlevania fan. Bullshit is something I can manage. And as to remind ourselves, this is the same franchise that gave us Simon's Quest and Medusa Heads. So let's think very critically here. And I don't know if it's the style or something, but some of the enemies that we've seen throughout the series appear here, and they look good as new. Hell, there's even new enemies sprinkled in this game too. And even some returning old ones. Remember that annoying ass frickin' whatever the hell that was in Adventure? Well, it's back, and they actually fixed it. So yeah, in summary, somehow they managed to revitalize old enemies to make them feel brand new. In terms of bosses, oh my god. Sure, stage 1's boss isn't too fantastic, as it's literally just giant bat again. But I can safely say that every other boss will either make you hate it or love it. Either because it's bullshit or it's because it's well designed. But to be more specific, I love stage 4's boss. I find it to be so unique how they managed to reuse the concept of a golem, but give it like new life in its moveset. Oh, and the Dracula fight in this game, oh my god. Granted, not my favorite interpretation of Dracula, but Phase 3 just amazes me every time I fight it. Don't know where the fuck he's making Jaguar sounds though, but you know what, whatever, we can move past that. The music in this game, as to be expected, is nominal. I love the sound fonts that they used for this game. It's like super iconic, and is extremely synonymous with the Adventure Rebirth. And by the end of it, it actually made me feel good about playing as Christopher Belmont. Look, my pool for favorite Belmont is very specific, but the fact that Christopher was able to get himself close enough is astounding. So yeah, although it's not top 5 or anything, like for fuck's sake it's number 8, I still think this game is worth playing through and looking at, cause it's a shame that not many people give it the acknowledgement that it deserves. This game goes hard in so many ways. Granted, dying in this game was frustrating, but at least it wasn't as frustrating as dying in the original. So yeah, we can safely move on to the next one. Oh, we finally got to our first Metroidvania on this list. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. The second Castlevania game to come out in the DS era, and frankly, the weakest out of the 3. Granted, that's not really saying much considering how good the other 2 games are. So even though it's the worst out of the 3, it's definitely still good. Hell, there's new mechanics that we've never seen before in a Castlevania game get implemented here. Granted, you could make a similarity between Dracula's Curse and this, however, I feel that the partnership mechanic in this game is very unique, and very Portrait of Ruin. Also, the tag team mechanic in this game, being that you combine both spells to make an ultra giant spell, is actually quite satisfying to pull off. As well as the fact that Charlotte, if you have her active right beside you, her health bar is basically your magic bar, so if that depletes, that means she's out of the picture. And vice versa, so I think the gameplay in this game is interesting. However, what else do I find fascinating about this game? Well, for starters, the locations are very memorable, partially due to the music of course, but also because of the well-designed thought pieces that are in some of the backgrounds, as well as the fact that some of the story takes place in some of these special locations. It's usually when you enter an area or when you're about to leave another area. Speaking of the story, this game is meant to be a sequel of Castlevania Bloodlines, as we now see the son of John Morris, as well as Charlotte Darlin, going on an adventure to stop whoever the hell is running amok in Dracula's castle. Hint hint, it's a guy named Brona, which his main motivation is to revive his daughters. And the way he goes about it is about the strangest way possible, and I never would have expected such a thing. Because you see, his proclaimed daughters are actually the daughters of Eric Lacard, who turns out died while trying to make sure that his daughters would not get into the grasp of Brona. So much for that one. And the game basically gives you 2 options, Dawn of Sorrow style, where you could save Stella and Loretta and turn them back to human, or you could just fucking murder them. Either way, Brona gets pissed. Oh, and another side story going on is that Death is in the castle, but he has no idea that the castle got usurped by Brona. It's not until the end of the game when he realizes that fact and kills him very swiftly, using Jonathan and Charlotte to weaken him, so to speak. And you can't go a Castlevania game without summoning Dracula. Yay. Look, I know this is rich, but Dracula's inclusion in this game just kinda feels forced. Like, there's 2 points where you could have ended the game. 1, where they defeated Brona, or 2, they defeated Brona, and Death shows up, kills Brona, so then Jonathan and Charlotte now have to fight Death in order to defeat him while the castle is crumbling. You could have ended it at those 2 instances, but instead, what the game decided to do was throw Death in there, say some spiel about reviving his master, leave, revives said master, and then boom, now you had to fight Dracula again. This game also does not have my favorite depiction of Dracula, but you know what, whatever, we'll just move on from that, because his second phase is actually really fucking cool. Like, holy shit, I know this game tried to experiment with 3D animations, but oh my god, they succeeded. This is one of the few Dracula fights where I actually feel threatened. But now I'm reminded of something. The bosses. Now, the bosses in this game range from okay to literal copying, because for some odd reason they decided to port over most of the bosses from Dawn of Sorrow at the end of the game. I wouldn't have a problem with this if A, the textures or styles or hell, even the sprites changed, or B, if it wasn't just Dawn of Sorrow that they ripped some of these bosses from. But no! They just straight up ripped from Dawn of Sorrow, which I know is rich considering that Castlevania rips enemies off all the time, but not bosses. Hell, in some instances, some bosses from earlier games become mainstay enemies in later games. For example, Slogra and Gaben. To me, this just feels like an attempt to pad out content at the end of the game. The rest of the bosses in this game range from okay, cool, to what the fuck did I just fight? However, out of all the games in the DS era, I'd argue that this game stayed the most faithful when it comes to boss selection, as a lot of classic bosses from the original Castlevania games show up in this game, albeit odd. Then we have the enemies, which are no big deal. Most of their sprites were taken from either Symphony of the Night or the GBA or hell, even Dawn. However, they did bring some new enemies to the mix, however, one of them looks like a worm. But speaking of enemies, there is a certain aspect of the partnership mechanic in this game that I neglected to mention earlier, because you see, this game incentivizes that you switch between Jonathan to Charlotte or Charlotte to Jonathan, because some enemies are more prone to physical attacks, while others are more prone to magical attacks. For example, if Jonathan were to attack an enemy that was more prone to magical attacks, the attack wouldn't do shit. You would need to switch to Charlotte in order to actually kill the damn thing. Vice versa when it comes to Charlotte. If an enemy is more prone to physical attacks, switch to Jonathan, so then that way you can actually get the job done. Some of the bosses are also like this, but not a majority of them. But to sum everything up, Portrait of Ruin is overall a very decent game. It's got its issues, but so do other Castlevania games. I think the partnership mechanic in this game is actually handled quite well. The stages range from decent to interesting. I just think the biggest disappointment was the bosses. Minus Dracula, you get a pass. Sure, some of the bosses had unique ideas put into them, but just because they're unique does not mean they're good ideas. I'm looking at you, Cauldron Slime. But overall, it's a decent game that I suggest anyone to check out. But I've been rambling about Portrait of Ruin for nearly 6 minutes now, so I think it's best that we move on to the next one on the list. So, I know there have been slight disagreements. Yup, the Castlevania game that occupied the number 6 spot on this list is none other than the very famous Castlevania Symphony of the Night. As I was going to say before getting severely ganged up on, it's not that I put it in 6 because Symphony of the Night is bad. Do remember that this is still a top 10 best Castlevania games list. However, it's just that, for me personally, there are better options. And not only that, but as time progresses, the technology gets better, and Symphony of the Night just continues to date itself in certain areas. But believe me though, the memes from this game, they'll live on forever, as will the music of this game. But something about the initial presence is no longer there. Perhaps this is symphony fatigue talking, but I've played the game about 4 times now, and frankly, I've started to see a lot of the cracks that it has. For starters, the game's balancing. In the early game, Death basically takes away all of your important weapons, and he hides them in various places, which basically means that you're going to be going throughout the entire castle looking for items that potentially may be your suit of armor that you had at the beginning of the game. Now granted, before Death took the armor from you, it's not like you can instant kill enemies anyway, and even so afterwards. As after all, Symphony of the Night is the first Castlevania game to start the Metroidvania category of games, as it really put the Vania in Metroidvania, as well as adding RPG elements, but that's kind of stereotypical for a Metroidvania at this point. Well, here's where we come to a problem. By the time you're even halfway, hell, maybe late game at this point, you will have items that can basically make you become God. And the problem is that this also extends to bosses as well. Because you see, this game has a problem where some of the items are far more powerful than they should be, as well as being a little too generous with the level up system, as well as giving certain attributes to Alucard throughout his journey, like HP max ups for example, as well as the fact that some of the armor in this game, although not plentiful, do offer more defense than you would expect. Granted, you may not see it, but it's there. And not only are you showered with plentiful of items, but you won't be using those items either because literally you don't have to use them. because there's never a situation where you'll be in that much of a dire situation where you need to use them. Sure, at the beginning of the game, when you're starting to get the hang of Symphony of the Night, sure, you may use like a potion here or there. But later on in the game, you'll become so overpowered that health will no longer be a concern to you. You will just more than likely just tank the hits until you can find a save room. Oh, and don't even get me started on the combinations. In this game, there are special inputs that you can put to do special moves that Alucard is able to perform. For example, stuff like Dark Metamorphosis and Hellfire. They did this because Alucard uses sub-items in this game, so they couldn't just stick it to a random analog stick and call it a day. So instead, they relied on inputs, which are 100% useless. Throughout my 4 playthroughs of this game, I have never once had to rely on any of the inputs due to how unreliable they are. In boss fights, or fights in general, I need quick decisions, and inputs do not allow me to do that. Oh, but speaking of the sub-items, just fuck all of them and just equip Holy Water, because that's the most broken and overpowered item in the entire game. See an enemy that's way overpowered than you? Throw Holy Water at it. Fighting Galamoth and don't know what to do? Spam Holy Water until it eventually dies. The only boss that I can really think of where Holy Water doesn't work is if a boss is levitating like Legion. But it's not really saying anything considering that Legion is so easy, even a fucking toddler can beat him. Which leads me to the point about the bosses. Although the bosses in this game and they have a varied cast, the problem is that they die very quickly. Especially in the Inverted Castle, where chances are if you grind for the Chrysogrim, yeah, no boss is going to be willing to stand up to you. But if you don't, congratulations, you still have Holy Water to work with. Sure, feeling like a god in a game like this is amazing. But when it's like 80% of the game and it's not even like a side mode, like Trevor mode in Curse of Darkness, it just sucks. And it's unfortunate too, because I want these boss fights to last longer. More so because I can listen to the music, but more importantly, some of these boss fights are very entertaining. Hell, the only boss that I can think of in this game where you'll be there for like a solid minute is Galamoth. Not even Dracula! For those who are unaware, Galamoth is the boss who has the highest amount of HP stats in the entire game. Not only that, but it's extremely hard to attack him if you don't know what you're doing. But thanks to the internet, there are more ways to exploit this boss fight than there are types of spiders out in the wild. The only fun that you'll see throughout this entire game is if you're playing this completely blind for the first time. That is what fun looks like. If you're playing this for like the second or third time, you already know what you're doing and you already know what most of the exploits are. And basically, it's just mindless button mashing until the very end. Now granted, it's cool button mashing, because you see, this game has a very distinct art style that I quite enjoy. In fact, I think this game houses the best sprite work in the entire series. Hint hint, that sprite work being for Alucard, by the way. The music in this game is also very memorable. In fact, my favorite song from this entire game has to be the theme for when you enter the Royal Chapel. Or hell, maybe even the introduction theme when you enter Dracula's castle for the first time. That shit hits! But then there's this game's major problem. The Inverted Castle. For God knows only what, they decided to put only 2 themes for the entire castle. One of which being Lost Painting, which plays for most of the fucking castle. I wouldn't have a problem with this if this was in 1 or 2 areas, not for 60% of the castle. Also, am I the only one who feels this way? But I genuinely feel that the Inverted Castle is just there to waste time. Sure, you can make an argument that in Harmony of Dissonance they do the same thing with the 2 castles mechanic. But you see, here's the difference. In one castle you have this route, but then in the other castle you have to go a whole different route just to get to the same place. Granted, you can argue that's tedious, but at least they went through the effort to actually change the movement patterns a bit, and getting to certain areas does not require the same kind of work that you did initially. Meaning that you had to find a whole new creative way to figure out how to get there. But in this game, no, it's just the same shit but with a different color and it's upside down. But alas, do not get me wrong. The characters in this game are great. Granted, they have PS1 dialogue, but I think that's what gives this game charm. In fact, I quite like the PS1 dialogue. And it's a shame too, because I was hoping that more Castlevania games did this other than Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. but they just simply chose not to. The main castle itself is great. It has some of my favorite locations in the entire series. As I mentioned earlier, the Royal Chapel, and even the Long Library, which has such a good fucking theme. Oh my god, it slaps so hard. Granted, I do have an issue with them reusing Richter's sprites, considering that he has a new freaking portrait now. But whatever, that's a nitpick at most. Oh, and have I mentioned that this game is highly overrated? But in short, this game is not bad. In fact, I highly recommend it if this is your first time going into the Castlevania series to actually play this game. It's just that when you replay this game, the flaws really start to show. But I can tell you, for a first experience, there will be nothing like it. And if there's one thing I can thank Symphony of the Night for, is starting a new era of Castlevania games that many fans like myself will remember till the end of time. Can I go now?
Would be best for this world.
Oh, thank Matthias himself. Bye! Alright, we finally made it to the top 5. And who exactly starts off our top 5 again? Oh, that one. Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, aka the Castlevania game that I constantly forget exists. Not because I hate it or anything, it's just more so because it escapes my mind. And it's surprising too, considering how good this game is. Now granted, I've said that about the other 5 games that I've mentioned on this list, including this one. However, this one is a special case, because you see, this Castlevania game specializes in one specific thing, and that being absolutely difficult. For some odd reason, during the development of the game, the people at Konami said to themselves, you know what would be great? If we had the difficulty of Dracula X, but chose to keep the Metroidvania style. And here's how we ended up with Order of Ecclesia. Compared to most of the Metroidvanias that will appear later on, this game is the hardest among them. Not only is it because the mechanics are quite complex in their understanding, but more so because the enemies do not give you a break. Hell, the bosses in this game are very relentless and they're very technical. Hell, you'll even struggle on the first few levels against a crab! Now granted, that fight was pretty cool now that I think about it in hindsight. But even still, this game is very difficult. I know I've said that like twice now. So what else about this game do I really enjoy? Well, the story for one. Granted, I don't like Shinoa as a character, but I can sympathize with her motivations. The entire story of Ecclesia is quite interesting, as well as the fact that this is one of the few games where there's an actual hub area. And by hub area, I mean you literally have to travel to a town, talk to people, get quests, and basically, boom, there you are, doing stuff around the map. Kinda reminds me of Portrait of Ruin in a way, where Eric would send you on specific missions, and if you get those done, you get special rewards. Can't remember exactly what rewards were given for Order of Ecclesia's side quests, but I'm pretty sure there were rewards. In terms of music, I can safely say that this game has one of my favorite OSTs from almost across the entire Castlevania franchise. And that's really saying something considering that we have a lot of good contenders when it comes to music. However, if I had to say specifically if it was like my number 1 or number 2, it'd be my number 2. And you'll see why later. Also, to this game's credit, there are a lot of original boss ideas. Hell, they even managed to turn a regular skeleton into the scariest thing I've ever fought. Not because they gave it like its creepy design or anything, it's more so because of how it moves. However, if there was one thing I would have to demote the game on is, well, the difficulty. Because as much as I'd like to appreciate how hard this Castlevania game is, the difficulty spikes are very much unwarranted, because there's a difference between actually being hard for the sake of challenging you, versus being hard just to fuck with you. In many cases, Castlevania games tend to challenge you with you, but at least in Order of Ecclesia's case, I feel like I'm being challenged so that way I can actually get to a greater goal. Then again, that's just me. Granted, I'm not the biggest fan of the every time you attack it wastes your MP bar sort of thing. However, it's not broken or anything, so Frankly, it's just a matter of preference. But if you find it to be quite enjoyable, I'd say go for Order of Ecclesia. Damn, it amazes me that 2 of the DS games actually made it onto this list, and not very far apart, mind you. I now do wonder what's gonna show up next. I know damn well none of you were expecting this one. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance takes the number 4 spot on this list. Now you must be wondering, Cereza? A fucking GBA game this far into the list? Have you gone mad? Well, clearly I haven't gone madder yet. So, what makes Harmony of Dissonance worth top 5 to me? Well, it's got my favorite character in it. Yes, out of all the Belmonts in this entire franchise, Richter, Simon, Trevor, my favorite is Juiced, a Belmont that no one has ever heard of. And it's a shame too, because his story in the Harmony of Dissonance game is actually quite intriguing, because you see, he has a bromance going on, but he also has a homance with Lady Erlanger. So what will he choose? His bromance with Maxim Kishnay, or his homance with Lady Erlanger? Oh, the choices. Spoiler alert, the true ending is that you choose both. As I mentioned earlier, this game has a dual castles mechanic, meaning you have Castle A and you have Castle B. Personally, I'm a fan of this mechanic. As to why, it offers me something to explore in the meantime, and it's not like Symphony of the Nights where it's literally just the same thing. Granted, the areas would look the same, however there are small to medium changes. And by that, I mean some areas do not have the same puzzles, so to speak, as once they did in Castle A. So something that would be in Castle A would not be in Castle B, and something that's in Castle B would not be in Castle A, and vice versa. Also, each of the castles has powerful items. It's not just like you can go to Castle B and just expect to get all the most overpowered shit in the game. No. Because you see, the way you move through the castle is very narrative driven. Because you have to go to specific areas first before going into other areas. So, for example, you'll be going between Castle A and B a lot. Hell, sometimes you won't even notice it. Also, I am a huge fan of the fact that you're allowed to collect furniture in the castle and take it to one specific room where Juiced redecorates it. I just think it's clever writing, because it goes to show how detail-oriented that Juiced is. God, I love things like this! In terms of gameplay, there's many to discuss. For starters, the sub-weapons return, however, this time they also return with tomes, which there are many different tomes. If I remember right, there should be 5. You have the Fire Book, the Ice Book, the Bolt Book, the Wind Book, and the Summoning Book. All of them allow you to do different things with your sub-items. And holy crap, depending on what sub-item you're using with depending on what tome you're using it with, you will get some overpowered results. Granted, it's slight hyperbole, but doing some of these spells feels so satisfying to pull off, especially the summoning tomes. Oh my Christ, I have never felt more powerful holding the cross than I ever did in the entire series until playing this. Hell, if you played this game strictly, people would start assuming that the cross was like the most powerful sub-weapon in the entire series. That's how good the cross is in this game. It's like Symphony of the Night's Holy Water, but except it's actually balanced, because the basic cross don't do shit. Now granted, we're dealing with the GBA here, so the music is not all too great. For what it is, it's actually quite decent. It's just that the problem is that, once again, GBA. And it's a shame too, because if a game like this were to come out in the DS era, people would not easily forget it as much. Hell, maybe I'm overthinking it, but maybe people would start to give it the credit it deserves, as it was the first good Castlevania game since Symphony of the Night, with Metroidvania style. Yeah, I know what I said. Plus, this was the first Castlevania game that I've ever 100%ed, in both modes, by the way. Oh, didn't you know? This game has a side mode where you can play as Maxim Kishnay. You know, your bro. It's basically like an alternate character route. It's not like Dawn of Sorrows, or hell, even Aria of Sorrows, where there's story implications here. It's more so like Curse of Darkness' Trevor mode, which is just there if you want to do it, but if you ask me, it's completely worth it. So if I was going on pure bias alone, this game would be number 1 on this list. However, I had to think more objectively, which is why this game only landed number 4 instead of number 1. Which, fair, considering that the other games that come later on in this list, I'd say it's a good placement. Oh, and fun fact, as of the release of Harmony of Dissonance in the year 2002, the last time we were able to play a playable Belmont was 1999 in Castlevania 64, because Reinhard Schneider is actually a Belmont. Yeah, I'm just as shocked as you are. However, as much as it pains me, we have to move on to the next game on this list. Goodbye, Dissonance. You will be missed greatly. Anyway, moving on. Alright, the number 3 spot is a little complicated. Castlevania Aria of Sorrow and Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. This is my list, I can do whatever the fuck I want. Now you may be wondering why I chose to put 2 games in the same spot in this list. Well, you see, there are many reasons. For starters, they're both very interconnected with each other. Meaning that, as we all know by now, Dawn is a sequel of Aria, and Aria is the direct prequel to Dawn. Case in point. And frankly, I enjoyed both of those games, so trying to figure out which one should go higher than the other, I frankly just couldn't do that, so I just put them in the same number. When there's a will, there's a way. So, what makes these 2 games so good exactly? Well, for starters, exploration! Oh, and the game's mechanics. Because in both Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, there's the mechanic where you get to steal souls and basically use whatever the ability of the souls are. There are 3 types of souls: Bullet Souls, Guardian Souls, and Chance Souls. The Bullet Souls basically replace the sub-items from previous Castlevania games, and basically allows you to use the ability of whatever monster you just took from. The Guardian Soul gives you your own fucking stand, and the Enchant Soul basically buffs a certain aspect of your character, like strength plus 150 or something. Usually these souls are color-coded, so it won't be difficult to figure out which soul is which. Now, figuring out what they do is another story, because although all of these souls have item descriptions, they're not quite clear most of the time. Oh, but there's a 4th soul I forgot to mention, and those are Grey Souls, which you can only obtain from defeating bosses. And basically, these souls grant you permanent abilities that you can use throughout your entire journey. You know, like double jumping. For some fucking reason. In terms of locations, there's a lot of solid places in these 2 games. You got places like the Forbidden Area, the Underground Reservoir, the Chaotic Realm, the Dance Hall, the Underground Cemetery, the Arena, the Guest House, the Pinnacle, the Mines of Judgment, you got the Cursed Clock Tower, and the Abyss. As far as music is concerned in these 2 games, they're excellent. Granted, one's of lower quality because, GBA, but I think it's to its benefit. However, if there's one thing I don't like about these 2 games is, well, consistency. Because you see, for some reason, they decided to go with the regular Castlevania art style for Aria of Sorrow, but then completely change it in Dawn of Sorrow, which to me is not good. Now granted, there are positives to this change. The characters are more expressive now. However, you could have achieved the same effects with the same art style, if you understand where I'm getting at. Hell, they even returned to an art style similar to the one they had prior in Order of Ecclesia. However, that took a few years to get to. So yeah, most of the DS games were formed by an anime art style, which I don't have a problem with, because in Portrait of Ecclusion's case, it actually benefited the game, as the game itself was more lighthearted than most of the other Castlevania games, so I see why they stick with it. In this case though, yeah, I don't see why. Granted, the opening for Dawn of Sorrow is sick as fuck, but that's really all I can say about art style in this game. In terms of sprite work, they can finally reuse most of the Symphony of the Night sprites again, which, yay. Say what you will about the GBA games, but at least the GBA games had to make their own sprites due to how advanced the Symphony of the Night sprites were. Now they just copy and paste it. Hell, for some reason they even reused Yoko's frickin' sprites. Also, as much as I love the art style from Aria of Sorrow, they did not make Yoko look good. But okay. Then we have a final thing to go over. The bosses. which I believe are some of the most memorable bosses in the entire series. Then again, we're spanning across 2 games here. However, there are some overlaps, if you really think about it. I will say though, Dawn of Sorrow houses the hardest death boss fight I've ever had to endure. It's not even hard in the fun way, it's just hard in the most tedious way possible. He's got the most ridiculous moves I've ever seen. How do you avoid half this shit? How am I supposed to know to avoid this? But you know what? I've beaten him many times before, so it's no big deal now. But if I were to make this review and still not have beaten his boss fight, oh, I'd be pissed. In terms of final bosses, these games really do deliver. In Aria of Sorrow, you have to fight Chaos, and I think this fight is special because it basically allows you to only fight with your weapons, as Chaos takes away all of your souls and you're supposed to fight him based on that. Meanwhile, in Dawn of Sorrow, you have to fight Menace, who is a literal giant menace. Oh, but if you thought Dawn of Sorrow was done with infuriating bosses, you'd be mistaken. Because in that game, you have a little guy called Gurgoth, and holy Jesus Christ, his fight is especially infuriating because you're not allowed to have a save room point until after you defeat him. So it's not like you can just simply teleport to a different part of the castle, stock up, and then teleport back. No. You have to reclimb that entire castle all over again just to fight him in case you are not stocked up well on weapons or any potions and shit. Have I mentioned that his hitboxes are bullshit? Oh, and there's something else about Dawn of Sorrow's boss fights. The DS. Because if you recall, every single DS had to use the bottom screen, aka the part where you have to use your stylus. And Dawn of Sorrow is of no exception. So how do you think we have to defeat bosses, exactly? Oh, that is just most likely correct. Because you see, you have to draw a certain pattern in order to seal away the boss's soul for good. That way you can just drain it, and boom, the ability is yours. However, this has every opportunity to fail, because it's like Skyward Sword's motion controls. If it works, it's great. If it doesn't work, fucking kill me. One point of Aria over Dawn is that I actually felt something with the villain. In Dawn's case, I just feel nothing for these people. I will say this, Dawn of Sorrow has the superior alt character mode, meaning that Julius mode in Aria of Sorrow ain't shit. Granted, Julius mode is still good, however, compared to Dawn of Sorrow's version, you not only get to play as Julius, but you also get to play as Yoko and Alucard, which is meant to be a game to Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse. Because in that story, Soma becomes Dracula, and now the three have to go throughout the entire castle that you adventured as Soma to kill him. Because it's heavily implied that the false ending that you get, where he turns into the Dark King, is the timeline that takes place in. However, there's one more infuriating boss that kinda got downgraded in the sequel, and that's being... Balor. This man was intense in Aria of Sorrow. In fact, I think he was the Gurgoth equivalent in that game. Because he was hard as shit. Because if you get punched by him, not only does it do massive damage, but you will knock back to the end of the room. And on top of that, he has 2 phases. So unless you don't know how to dodge fire, well, you ain't going past that, I'll tell you what. But, in short, the bosses in Aria and Dawn of Sorrow are very fun to fight. Granted, they're not the best fights in the series, but I frankly believe that they're worth the time and effort that you put into them. The stories of these 2 games are very interesting, and they'll keep you hooked from start to finish. The gameplay is very solid, in fact I think it perfects most of the gameplay elements that Symphony of the Night started. And frankly, the main cast of characters are quite the enjoyable cast. And look at that, a Castlevania game with no Dracula in it. See, we are making progress. It goes to show you that Dracula does not need to be an actual Castlevania game for it to be a good Castlevania game. Oh wait, technically Summer Cruise is Dracula. Well shit. Anyway, moving on to number 2. Now you must be thinking, what game could possibly be better than Aria and Dawn of Sorrow put together? Well, Castlevania Lament of Innocence. I'm sure I'm gonna get lovely comments. If putting Symphony of the Night in 6 wasn't gonna do it, then this surely would be. Yes, a 3D Castlevania game ranks this high in the list. And you know what? I feel no shame in that. Because by any of the Castlevania game's margins, this game is by far the most replayable game in the entire franchise. I shit you not. The amount of modes that this game has to offer is absurd. And frankly, I had fun with all of them. But first, let's go over the main criticism of this game, that being the camera angle. Considering that the Castlevania games that came before it, at least in the 3D space anyway, were Castlevania 64, it really didn't have much to go off of, so it kinda just feels like a Resident Evil sort of camera at times. But frankly, I think it's to its benefit. It's kind of annoying when you can't see the enemy that's right in front of you. However, considering your varying attacks and the fact that you have many tools to your disposal, it really doesn't hurt you all that much. Plus, this is the first time we actually get enemy designs in 3D, so that means you can't copy anything. But how are the enemies in this game anyway? Well, they're actually quite fun to deal with, except for the fucking ogres, because for some reason, every single game where an ogre is introduced, it's the most annoying thing since AIDS. And believe it or not, you don't feel overpowered in this game, especially if you have the vampire killer. The only game mode where you feel overpowered is when you play as Jakim, and he's a freaking vampire. However, let's shift back to Leon, and mention another criticism of this game. The models. You can definitely tell where they spent most of their time on, and it shows. Because the character models in this game are atrocious for a PS2 game. Like, holy crap, I know this game was rushed, but you need to tell me that you guys didn't work out a solid foundation for the characters until like midway you started development. Granted, some of the attire that these characters wear are amazing. However, it's just that the characters themselves, face-wise, are some of the ugliest things I've ever seen. And it's kind of hard to sympathize with any of this, considering that there are sad moments in this game that you're meant to feel sorry for them, but you can't because the facial expressions are just off. I will say though, something that this game does not lack though is good voice acting, because this game definitely has it. When it comes to the voices of Ronaldo, Leon, Walter, sometimes, and Matthias, I think this is an excellent cast to work with. And speaking of the characters, I think the characters are well written. Yeah, boo-hoo me all you want, but I genuinely believe this notion, because frankly, I genuinely feel the struggles of these characters, even if the models don't reflect that. And personally, Walter has become my favorite vampire. Hell, even over Dracula in some instance. I would love to see Walter come back in a future Castlevania game where the Crimson Stone is just shattered and his soul is released. That would be so cool! However, that is just a mere idea I have. Hell, even the side character of Jakim is interesting, considering that he fought Walter beforehand. And even in his own side mode, you can get a cinematic ending where he is the one who takes the throne. Now that is badass. Also, did I forget to mention that you can play as a pumpkin in this game? Yeah, I shit you not. You can play as a literal pumpkin who starts off with the vampire killer and basically reuses all of Leon's moves from the jump. But seeing him run is the funniest thing I've ever seen. It's so adorable. This game also is very action-oriented, as it requires you to learn combos in order to defeat enemies. However, it's not like Devil May Cry combos or anything. It's just like your standard strings of attacks that allow you to do extra damage. Plus, sub-items return! Harmony of Dissonance style. Because you see, in this game there are souls you can collect by defeating the bosses in each of the rooms that you go to. There's 5 in specific you can go to. However, here's the order that I went in. You can go to the House of Sacred Remains, then to the Gardens of Forgotten Time, then you can go to the Anti-Souls Laboratory, then you can go to Dark Waterfalls, and then you can end it off with the Ghostly Theater. Only then will you get access to the Mystic Pagoda and be able to fight Walter. But not until you backtrack and go fight the frickin' thing in his basement. Oh yeah, Walter has a fucking eldritch horror in his basement. Oh, and these souls also double as basically tomb, so it allows you to do different versions of the sub-items that you have. So for example, if you were able to obtain one of the souls, instead of just doing the regular throw the frickin' cross around, you'll be able to do Holy Cross. But speaking of the bosses, you'd have quite the selection. I'm sorry, but what the fuck is this? I know everyone damn well knows what this looks like, so I'm not even gonna bother mentioning what it is. However, ignoring that, this game has some of my favorite bosses in the entire series. But when I say favorite, I mean like about 4 of them. Those being Yakim, Walter, the Forgotten One, which is the Eldritch Horror in his basement by the way, and Death himself, who in this game is actually quite difficult. He's not Dawn of Sorrow difficult, but he puts up a good challenge. Also, did I forget to mention that this chronologically is the first game in the entire franchise? Because you see, Dracula is not Dracula yet. It's only until the end of the game where we see Matthias, who is Leon's best friend, turn into Dracula himself, using the soul of Walter Bernhard. Yes, that's his name. Quit laughing. And it's so interesting too, because Matthias tried to lure Leon into him and become a vampire because of all the things that Leon has gone through. But you see, here's the problem with that. The only reason as to why Leon had to go through any of that was because of Matthias and how he orchestrated every single thing. God, I wish we can get more games where Dracula is just like a mastermind manipulator, instead of a man who's just lost his temper. Because in subsequent games, it's Death who's the manipulator, not Dracula. So it's actually refreshing to see Dracula actually using his brain for once. Also, I really like Matthias. He's so perfect. God, I can gush over him all day. But frankly, that's all I have to mention for Lament of Innocence, as frankly, I believe this to be a semi-perfect Castlevania game experience. Not only does it start chronologically, but it's also one of the best Castlevania games that I've ever played. Granted, at times it feels longer than it should, however, that's every Castlevania game for you when you have no idea what you're doing, or you're just stuck in one area. But now, we move on to the final Castlevania game in this list. For the Castlevania games that didn't quite make the list but are still good in my book, are the following. Super Castlevania 4. Although I can commend most of your game's accomplishments as being the best 2D Castlevania game for its time, there's just better options. Castlevania Judgment. Bro, it's not that bad. Get a handle of the gameplay and get a handle of the controls. Then you'll see how quickly you'll start to love the game. Granted though, the cutscenes are very not for English. Castlevania The Adventure 2. Surprisingly the best sequel I've ever seen if we're going based on comparisons to the second. I was honestly amazed at how good this game was. So congrats Game Boy team. Castlevania Harmony of Despair. From the demo that I played ages ago, it seemed like a fun experience. Granted, I don't think I liked being timed though. If only I could play with people though. That'd be great. Castlevania Grimoire of Souls. I thought about putting this on the list, but I chose not to, considering that it's a mobile game. But in all things considered, for a mobile game, it's actually quite the great experience. I even consider it the non-canonical third installment of the Sorrow trilogy. Reason why I say non-canonical is that I don't know if it's canon or not. Personally though, it could fit in the canon if need be. Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. Although not a Castlevania game by name, it is a Castlevania game in our hearts. Also, it's made by the same person who made Symphony of the Night Onward. Anyway, we can go back to number 1 now. Now, for the one we've all been waiting for. The best Castlevania game in the entire franchise is... Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Yup, the game that I reviewed almost about a month ago is my favorite Castlevania game in the entire franchise. Why, you may ask? Well, I recommend watch that video and figure it out, but I'll basically sum up all the points that I made in that video over here. The story of Hector trying to John Isaac is by far one of the most interesting stories that Castlevania has ever told. Not based on concept, but more so based on execution, as in the process it's created memorable characters that even to this day still hold the test of time. The gameplay and the mechanics are by far some of the most engaging in the series, as I truly love the mechanic of devil forge masting and the innocent devils that this game has plentiful of. In terms of story, the game has me engaged from start to finish. To visuals, I think this game is by far the best 3D Castlevania game, as there's so many things to look at and there's so many different things to explore. There's even that room. I still don't know why it's there, but it's there. The enemies in this game, although sometimes very infuriating due to a certain mechanic, I think most of the enemies are well crafted and their designs are just fantastic. As for bosses, they are so great. Even though most of them fit in the decent category, when they are good, they are great. And by far this game has the best Dracula boss fight that I've ever had the pleasure of fighting. In terms of music, it's by far my favorite OST in the entire series, as it's the only Castlevania game that I listen to regularly on a daily basis. Hell, even before editing this video, I listened to a lot of Curse of Darkness' OST, because it helps me get through the editing process. So yeah, if you haven't already, I suggest checking out my Curse of Darkness video as to where I go into more detailed points about the game. But yes, those were my top 10 best Castlevania games of all time. Am I going to get some people who disagree with me? Oh, most definitely. Have you seen this list? But I'm just glad that they were able to see this list and appreciate my love for these games. Although we won't be getting a Castlevania game anytime soon, at least we can stick to these timeless classics for entertainment. I'm Sir Valentine, and remember, stay cherryful. Where the fuck is my house?